Good evening. Welcome to another exciting program of the Queen's Grapevine. This is your host, Wallingford Lee. Tonight in the Queen's Grapevine, we're going to talk about the great migration that took place with most African Americans moving from the South to the North. When we talk about the North, we're talking about coming up to Chicago, Detroit, New York, Philadelphia, and certain part of Washington, D.C. But more importantly, when we talk about this great migration that took place, I would go back from 1910 all the way up to 1970 and the impact that this migration had, why most people wanted to leave the South. Very simple. All the crazy Jim Crow laws, the segregation, the racism, and the behavior that took place in the South. That barbaric behavior against people of color. And as such, a little before World War I and after World War I, how much the industry opened up so much in these industrial areas where jobs were needed. And a lot of people went off to war, and the labor force needed people. And again, as we visit in this program today, you're going to have the opportunity to know what so many people went through when this migration took place. It gives us a great deal of pleasure to be back here at Lehman College talking about these sensitive issues. We have two of our special guests that we have had the opportunity to work with before. We're talking about Brother Hank Williams, who is part of the African American Studies Department at the college here, and also Miss Mary Phillips. Welcome to our program, both of you.
Thank you.
Yeah. Well, let's start a little bit with you, Ms. Phillips. What is your recollection in terms of things that you have read and heard about this great migration that took place early years ago?
Well, I think a couple of things to point out with the Great Migration are the push and pull factors that centered around the Great Migration. And when I say the push and pull factors, I'm talking about the factors that push blacks from the South to the North. And some of those things included lynchings, right? Included the sexual exploitation of black women. As well as included sharecropping. With the system of sharecropping, how it worked is the farmers were often put in a state of servitude, always in a space of debt, always owing money, if you will. You had the boll weevil, which was a larvae at the time that was kind of taking control of the cotton of the particular farm, and it was destroying, the materials that they needed to use, and so destroying plants essentially. And so all of these factors, aside of the fact that they're constantly in a state of servitude, was impacting these push factors to get out of the South. In addition, you had the pull factors that were pulling blacks from the South to the North, and that included money, better opportunities, family, right? At the time, blacks wanted a chance at the American dream, if you will, and so they believed that going from the South to the North could give them that opportunity. It wasn't quite like that, as we all know, but again, because of the segregation, because of the Jim Crow that was going on during a particular period. It wasn't quite what they thought it would be. Better jobs, better education. These are the kind of pull factors that many blacks were really trying to adhere to, if you will.
Well, not only that, I think they was trying to escape also to have a little bit more freedom of expression and have job opportunities. Coming up to the North, was that a great idea, in your estimation?
I think in some ways, when we think about the Great Migration after, the Great Migration, this period lasted for some while, but then there was still a lot of blacks that were still down south after the Great Migration, after that particular period. And so, it's hard to say if it was better or worse, because you have the same kind of violence that was occurring in the North that was occurring down south. You had exploitation, you had assaults on black bodies, you had a multitude of the same kind of issues, Jim Crow, segregation. And so in some ways, I think it's a complex question to answer, but I think at the very least, it was this whole idea of better opportunities. Yeah.
Good. Interesting. Well, Brother Williams, what do you thought caused such this great migration? What do you think caused our brothers and sisters to leave the South? Was it racism, job opportunities, or just the crazy Jim Crow laws them down there?
Well, I think Mary Phillips covered it pretty well in her response. The short answer really is all of the above. You know, certainly lynchings and the really generalized nature of, we talk about lynchings, but there's sort of a generalized nature of violence that's going on. You know, and many of your listeners may have seen the film 12 Years a Slave, which I think lays it out. I mean, obviously we're talking fiction and we're talking an earlier time period, but it lays it out fairly nicely in terms of really just sort of the randomized violence that black people could run into at almost any time, really for almost any sort of reason. So that's certainly one factor. The economic pieces Mary covered well, so I don't really think I need to go into it very much. But the other piece is also, you're talking about a country that's changing on the macro level, and maybe we'll talk about that a little bit later. But the big shift from urban to rural, and changes in the economy in terms of that. There are opportunities for people to work in industrialized settings, and even though they're making relatively little money at all, unionization isn't real big. There's the opportunity for a type of life that is just completely unimaginable in the South. Part of which you simply just have to talk about infrastructure. A lot of places in the South, they don't have running water, indoors, things like that. Schools, aren't very prevalent. If you want your children to be able to get educated and possibly, have a better life, segregation, and that's going on in the North too. So I think it's a combination of all those factors that are really creating the type of situation that we see
Back then. Here's the important part. How did people move in order to get up here? Was it by train, by bus, by their own car? How did they make this great migration?
You're talking primarily by train. And I imagine a lot of it depends exactly which time period you're talking about too. Certainly in the early years of the 20th century, I mean, we think about the internet now, but the big technological revolution then is in transportation, and you're talking trains, and it's the era where railroads have a dominant sort of transportation position. They've a lot of the lines we're used to thinking about now, say the Northern Corridor and Amtrak. I mean, that's something that was relatively recently built by the Pennsylvania Railroad, New York Central, and other railroads at the time. So they had sunk those infrastructure costs in, and they then needed to get them back, not only in terms of freight, but also in terms of passengers. Mm-hmm. And remember, this is obviously decades before airlines are even going to become a type of factor. Motor vehicle technology is nowhere near what it's going to be even a few decades after that. So a lot of people are coming up by train, and one of the things you see is railroads actually send some of their agents down south and are recruiting people, not just to come up in terms of work, but also giving them deals on transportation too. So that causes a good bit of it.
It certainly did. Mary, let's talk about one thing. What did it do for the South when most African American left the South? There was a lot of slavery down there. So my question to you basically is, what happened to the economy down there, one, and two, those people that used to carry on this slavery behavior against people of color, what happened to them from an economic standpoint of view?
Mm-hmm. Well, when we want to talk about economically, those systems still stayed in place, right? Those systems are still in place today. And so what is important to point out when we talk about the processes of the Great Migration, also to add on to what Hank said, the whole family couldn't come initially,
And
right?
leave some behind.
Right, and so they would leave some behind, and then they would send for their family to come up. So they had to get set up. They had to, find a space, and maybe if they can find someone down south or down up north, to help them get set up or what have you. And then they would send money until they were able to send their loved ones up. And so that system of lynchings and of Jim Crow segregation was still very much in place. And like I said, there was still a lot of blacks that were still down south. So it wasn't like it was so many blacks where it was just this, complete, lack of a population there. There was still a thriving population there while there was still a mass migration going on.
Very interesting. And let's talk about one thing that's very important. We know for a fact that most people that was part of this migration went to Philadelphia, went to Chicago, went to Detroit, certain part of Washington, D.C., and Philadelphia. Where was the largest part of the migration going to, the largest portion? And what type of difficulties they encounter when they move up north?
Well, wow, that's a big question. In terms of difficulties, you're really talking about, ironically, a lot of the things that we see today in terms of the urban situation. Probably the one thing that I would focus on is, one of the things you have to remember is that you're talking largely about rural people coming to an urban type environment. So it's not only the dislocation in terms of where they are, they're getting hit with a completely different part of life. Cities then are not necessarily what we know them to be now. A lot of the infrastructure is still in the process of being built. But the writer Richard Wright, in the second half of his autobiography, Black Boy, a lot of people are probably familiar with the second half of it, and it actually leaves off with him leaving down south. But the second half of it, which didn't get published until later on, deals with his arrival up in the north in Chicago in the dead of winter, and he describes the city as if he was living inside of a machine, I believe the words are that he uses, where cold forces hit and push you. And anybody who's read Native Son, gets a sense, at least fictionally, of what might one possible fate that might happen to one Southern boy who comes up and just is completely unable to handle the Northern type of situation and the type of interactions that you're coming with. Now, obviously, all that is fiction, but Wright did an extreme amount of research for it, and he also had some of his own personal experience that he put into it. So all those experiences are the types of things you're talking about. You're talking about people coming up, being economically exploited. Even very simple things like the type of scams that go on now. People come up, somebody says, "Oh, well, I'm from the same area of Georgia. Yeah, you're looking for a place to stay? Okay, well, you know what? Give me $5, and I'll go around and talk to somebody in this building for you." Of course, the guy disappears. Never ever comes back. So even little things like that to bigger things about getting into these exploitive work situations. As I said, a lot of the places either aren't unionized, or some of the places that are unionized, the unions are segregated, so black workers are pitted against white working class. And you have the other types of things that are going on in terms of the city, in terms of crime, in terms of vice, in terms of living situations that are certainly better than people had down south. At least most of the time the structures themselves are a little bit better. They might have indoor plumbing, but you're really talking about atrocious situations, partially because they're not going to, they're not only are they not going to, they're not able to go to the more stable housing. Public housing doesn't exist then. So a lot of time you're talking about tenement buildings, which are just horrific.
Wow.
And it's so the living situation is really killing almost as many black children as just about any as disease or anything else is.
Very interesting. When we get back in the Queen's Grapevine, we're going to continue talking about the great migration that took place from the south to the north, and more importantly, the strength of the black woman. It's important to know back then, at that time, that woman had to work at home, take care of children, and in some cases, work at an Anglo's home and do the job and still come home and do some work and support her black man. We'll be right back in the Queen's Grapevine as we continue talking about the migration from the south to the north.
In addition to the educational opportunities in the north, Benny Mae Tillman's father was able to find a better job to support their 9 children. Chicago's black population grew from 2% of the total in 1910 to over 50% of the entire city's population today. The largest influx of blacks into Chicago occurred after World War II.
And we're back here in the Queen's Grapevine as we continue talking about the great migration that took place in the early 1900s. Most African American moving away from the South for a better life because of segregation, racism, and all the terrible things that took place in the South. And the things that they encounter in the Midwest, in Chicago, Detroit, Cleveland, was a little bit different. While they had a better life in terms of job opportunities and probably a little bit better living, but it was not a great deal. They had to make it on their own. It was not easy. And, you know, the purpose of putting together a program like this, because we want to go back in memory lane for those youngsters who doesn't understand the true history of what have taken place and how they got to where they are, and the strength of their parents, the strength of the black woman. We do a program of this magnitude to talk a little bit about things that took place years ago. Remember, we was talking a little bit about the strength of the black woman in terms of back in the early 1900s when they moved up north, they had to look for days' work. Sometimes it was a living job. They had 2, 3 children and still had to come in and take care of their kids and take care of their family. Can you walk us a little bit through some of that and some of the organization, or black organization, female black organization that took place in those days?
Yeah, what's interesting is that in the South, black women would, migrate to the North. One of the key issues was the sexual exploitation that was happening with black women. They go to the North, they're still being sexually exploited, right? And so this becomes a key issue, particularly when we talk about black women. Black women have not had the luxury of not working, right, as opposed to other communities, right? Oftentimes working for white women, right, working almost in a state of servitude, if you will, and getting abused at the same time, right, and working for literally practically nothing.
Peanuts.
Yes, and so this was a major issue, and so black women's organizations during this time was extremely critical, right? You had organizations like the National Association of Colored Women, the Detroit Housewives League, the NACW, National Association of Colored Women, had a motto, lifting as we climb, right? And so these women literally, you talk about self-help and uplifting the community. They would provide resources, right? Head Start centers. You could come to the NACW for support politically, economically, socially, or what have you. It's the same thing for the Detroit Housewives Leagues, right? Provide better economic opportunities, right? Have a
So
opportunity.
it was support groups then?
Yes, absolutely. It was support groups. These opportunities for consciousness raising sessions that happen as well. Where you could talk with other sisters. And talk about some of the disenfranchisement that you may have been encountering and get resources or what have you, and that help to build a supportive community. And so it's critical to point out black women's organizations that were developing at that time.
That's very powerful to know that, considering the little help, if none, that America had to black people back in that time, that these women had the intestinal fortitude, the strength, the vision, and the intestinal power to put together organization to help one another. And they should be commended for things like that, won't you say?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely, absolutely. And you can't mention the NACW without mentioning women like Ida B. Wells, for example, who was, a crusade in fighting against lynching, a crusader in fighting against lynching. And the work she did, during this particular time, black men were getting lynched in high numbers, most often for the idea or the false idea that black men were raping white women. And Ida B. Wells, using white journals, dispelled that myth and essentially said, no, these were consensual relationships. Black men were not raping white women, but indeed these were consensual mutual relationships. However, black men were getting lynched, and the work that she did in her anti-lynching work really paved the way, and she's often overlooked when we talk about black women's organizing and black women's political efforts in really combating social injustices on behalf of the black community.
Obviously, some strong kudos should go to her for the great work that she did, bringing these things out, obviously.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Let's talk a little bit that a lot of people feel that once you came up north, there was no racism and stuff like that. Our research shows that so much racism took place in Chicago with most of the brothers and sisters that came up from the South that I think back in 1919 there was a tremendous race riot in Chicago because black men would go out and work, and some white guys think that the job was being taken away from them, and they begin attacking them, lynching them, as Mayor just mentioned, and stuff like that. How bad was the racism up north for people from this, black people coming up from the South?
It was extremely bad, and one of the things that I think we should remember is 1919, they called it Red Summer. So you really have this wave of race riots and disturbances really almost all over the country, but just about any sort of urban area where you have that type of interaction. And part of it is simply just attention, because you have to realize at the same time black migrants are coming up from the South. You also have European migration from Europe, and that's one of the key periods too. So, you really have that tension and competition for jobs, and often, really often is tragic, but you often have groups pitted against each other.
Wow.
for the few jobs that are available. But I think to get back to that point, some of it comes from direct racism. Honestly, they weren't using those words at that time, but what we now call police brutality, that sort of thing. Community gets, one last black boy or black man or black woman gets killed or beat up or disrespected, and the community just starts tearing stuff up. Other times it's the opposite, and you have black communities being attacked. Probably the most obvious, well, maybe not the most obvious, but one of the better known examples is Black Wall Street, Tulsa, Oklahoma, 1921. You have a thriving black community that's probably one of the strongest, healthiest, most economically self-sufficient in the country. It actually has more infrastructure than the neighboring white community, and because of a manufactured type thing, the black community is attacked. And when I mean attacked, I mean literally. We're talking with guns and people being driven out. It gets so bad that a airplane is actually used, and dynamite is dropped to blow up a couple of the buildings.
Wow.
I mean, this is how serious it is. And part of that also comes from the fact that you have some black soldiers who served in World War I and, actually saw combat and came back, and that changes. And we see a similar type of thing later on with World War II, Korea, Vietnam, but that changes our outlook. These are people who fought the Germans and have been mowed down in, awful type of fighting type conditions, and all of a sudden so their whole perception in terms of what they're able to do and what they can do and what they can stand up to is changed. So when they come back and they're facing this type of racism, and you're talking about people who have been trained to actually use weapons and defend themselves in their country. So when they come back and it comes time to either defend their community or be
themselves.
right, or be put back in that place, a lot of them are just at the point where they're not going to take it, because you're talking about young men, and we're talking primarily men at this point in the military.
Who serve?
Right, who've been battle hardened, and they basically say no. Yeah.
We got approximately maybe about three minutes left on our program. We want to talk about now. My understanding in my research, it tells me that the migration stopped in 1970. Was it worthwhile in the long run?
To migrate to the north, again, I think that's a very complicated question, because if we look at the United States in general, right, the north or the south, racism, institutional racism, violence, exploitation, disenfranchisement is still happening. And it's still happening in the same kind of ways that it was happening in these periods that we're talking about. And so, again, you go down south, like, Hank was talking about, in some of the infrastructure going on down south. In some spaces, it's still like that. You know what I'm saying? In some spaces up north, it's still like that. And so I think that's a very complicated question. And it's still, until we really, really start changing laws, we really start fighting for social justice. And when I say that, I'm talking about, in particular, politicians, and I know some politicians are working towards that, but I mean, until we have social justice across the board, we're still going to really have these issues.
It's a shame, but unfortunately, you happen to be right. And we have approximately a minute. We discussed a lot about this migration. To close out, how do you feel about it? You think it was worthwhile?
Well, ultimately, it's what happened, and you have to take a look at both sides of it. And one of the things you get is, huge explosion in the arts, which we didn't really even get a chance to talk about. You have many strong communities that end up being built that wouldn't have happened, and you also have the downsides that we're still seeing today. And I think the big question is, well, how do we use that to give us insight in terms of moving forward and moving ahead, building organizations, rebuilding communities, and possibly fulfilling some of the promise that our grandfathers and great-grandfathers and mothers weren't able to get.
On that note, I want to take the opportunity on behalf of the family of Grapevine to say to both of my guests, thank you so much for sharing your point of view. I think the migration was very good. I think there was a lot of pain. I think urban America changed a lot with the migration of African American coming up from the South. They brought a lot. They brought their food. They brought their music. They brought their hard work. A lot of free labor has been given to America by African American, and it's about time that they're given the respect that they really truly do. In behalf of the family of Grapevine, I just want to say good night. Thank you for watching our program, and we hope that it has been an enjoyment to you. Thank you.